It was 30 minutes later, after they'd all eaten breakfast and began coasting down the bay, that Neil, on his way forward to check the Genoa, placed one foot on the little step built into the cabin wall and stopped. He stared at the cockpit deck. A thin, barely visible layer of something lay on the cockpit floor. He bent over and ran an index finger for a few inches along the deck and looked at it. A grey smudge. He looked up at the sky above him. A thin haze marred the blue summer sky. He went quickly over to the opposite cockpit. The same thin layer of ash covered the deck around the fishing gear and other salvage from Lucy May. He felt trapped. To the south lay a thick cloud over Norfolk. To the northwest the closer, more diffuse grey fog from the blast over Washington. And on the deck at his feet, the first radioactive fallout. "Frank!" he shouted. Still bleary-eyed from weariness, Frank left the wheelhouse and stumbled into the cockpit. "We've got fallout on deck," Neil told him in a quiet voice. Frank reached down to examine the ash, and then looked back at Neil. "Everybody should go below," he said. "I'll wash the fucking stuff off the decks." Frank and Neil sent everyone into the main cabin and ordered them to shut all windows and portholes and check for ash, wiping off and throwing overboard any they found. Since every thickness of material between them and the radioactive fallout would give some small additional protection, Skippy was put on the floor underneath the dinette table, and a jury-rigged wall of plywood was used to create a cave. The table was covered with blankets and sleeping bags from the forepeak. Jean ordered Lisa to crawl under it too. Ollie suggested Jean make a space next to the daggerboard well and beneath the crossbeam for greater protection. Conrad Macklin went into the forepeak and covered himself with bagged sails. On deck, Frank began washing down the boat with buckets of seawater and a long-handled brush. Neil disappeared for a while and then emerged wearing full foul weather gear, including rubber boots and a hood tightly wound around his face as if he were about to go out into a gale. He handed a full set to Frank and took over the washing down of the boat while Frank put on his gear. Jim had checked the Genoa, and when he came aft, Frank ordered him below with the others. He and Neil would stay on deck. As he set sail down the Chesapeake for the Atlantic, a low-level dread hung over all of them as they huddled in the main cabin. They talked in low voices, like mourners at a wake. On the horizon, to both north and south, lay the ugly grey cloud masses that seemed to be creeping up the sky to kill them. One was chasing down from the north, and they were sailing south into the one over Norfolk. There was no escape. When Vagabond sailed past Tangier village, Neil looked dully at the wreckage. Two large fishing trawlers lay on their sides among the shells of three houses tilted crazily, as if all five were some child's toys carelessly cast aside. One of the buildings must have been the bar they had stopped at the night it all began, but even though his binoculars he could not tell which building it was, he saw no signs of life. To the east the shore was too distant to reveal what had happened, but as Vagabond sailed out into the middle of the Chesapeake, Frank sighted the capsized hulk of a motor yacht a quarter of a mile to starboard. Other floating vessels became visible, a sailboat sailing south like Vagabond, and two other boats coming from the direction of Norfolk. With a sense of foreboding, Neil realised that on the previous day the bay had been crowded with boats, 35 or 40, when he'd been searching for the site of the stolen Vagabond. Not many had survived the explosion and tidal wave. It was Frank who spotted the first corpse, a limp, wet lump of clothing floating face down less than 50 feet from Vagabond's course. Frank's first instinct was to alter course to retrieve the body, but then he quickly realised the last thing they needed on board was a corpse. There would be more. The two ships coming towards them remained close to the western shore and soon disappeared past them, headed up the Cheapsake to God knows where. That they had survived at all was a surprise. The sailboat, on the same course as Vagabond, disappeared into a cove or a river on the western shore. By late morning they seemed to be all alone on the vast expanse of the bay. With a sense of dread and impotent anger, Neil observed that enough dust would accumulate in a half-hour's time to form a visible grey film. He and Frank alternated doing the cleaning work, both of them getting overheated and exhausted in their stifling foul-weather gear on the increasingly hot day. His face dripped with sweat. One of them would plod over the entire length and breadth of the boat with a big plastic bucket and a long-handled brush, dipping the bucket into the bay, pouring it across the deck, and then rapidly brushing to push everything back into the water. When he was finished, he would stumble back to the other man at the helm, and without a break the other would take up the exhausting work. At 11:30 Frank collapsed on the foredeck. Neil rushed forward and dragged him back, loosening his foul weather gear. He hoped it was only heat exhaustion, and he carried Frank below where he could be undressed and cooled off. Ollie took Frank's pace, wearing his own foul weather clothing. Macklin was ordered to take a turn next. 40 minutes later Frank reappeared on deck, dressed again in full gear, and ordered Neil and Macklin to go below, saying that if they rotated 4 men, none of them would get overheated again. Ollie came up again to share the ordeal. Down in the main cabin, Neil was struck by the stuffy, close atmosphere and by the silence. The wet towels they'd used to cool Frank down were still draped over the galley shelves. Lisa and Skippy were squeezed into the doghouse under the dinette table. Jim was sitting back against the galley cabinets with a styrofoam cooler and a settee cushion on his lap, and Jean was huddled beside the daggerboard, well, with a settee cushion covering most of her. Neil stripped off his foul weather stuff and rubbed himself down with one of the wet towels. Macklin crawled into the forepeak cabin. "Mummy says the rain has radioactive germs in it," Skippy said, suddenly peeking his head out of his cave. "Did you see them?" "1 or 2, Neil answered. "I kicked them overboard." "Mummy says you're washing them overboard," Skippy corrected. "She's right." Lisa also peered out. "Is it still falling?" she asked. "A little bit probably," Neil answered, "but we're keeping the boat so clean you can't tell." He knew better, of course. The stuff was still falling, although even Neil thought at a slightly lower rate. And though they were a lot better off here than on land, they were still being exposed, especially those who had to work on deck. Jean crawled out from her hideaway. "You should get under the crossbeam," she said. "You've been exposed already much more than we have." He glanced up at the space, then at her. He wanted to lie down and wanted to feel protected. "Can we both squeeze in there?" he asked, frowning. "No, but you go ahead." He hesitated, but the thought of being able to lie down won out over gallantry. He realized how exhausted he must be. He stepped over Jim's legs, held Jean briefly as he passed her, and then crawled into her space. She covered him with her cushion and sat down beside Jim. Vagabond sailed on. Below, no one spoke. It was at about 2 o'clock, after they had sailed 24 miles down the bay and to within 40 miles of Norfolk, that they came upon the floating hulk of a charter fishing vessel and its passengers. There had been no measurable fallout since Neil had gone below about an hour and a half before, so Frank had let Ollie remain on duty with him rather than bringing Neil up again. But when he saw the derelict, he called down for Neil. Frank had altered course when he saw the survivors waving frantically at him, and with a gloomy, doomed expression he now ordered Neil and Ollie to prepare to pick them up. The hulk lay low in the water, its afterdeck crowded with 15 to 20 people, men, women, and children, a seemingly random collection of those who had escaped the disasters of somewhere to blunder into the disaster of the explosion over Norfolk. A large man with a blonde beard emerged from the crowd to stand on the cabin roof and shout that they had been swamped by a tidal wave and, with flooded batteries, were helpless. The two vessels rolled and pitched awkwardly in the swells, and when they were rafted together at last, their decks sometimes slammed together with a sickening crunch. Frank surveyed the packed near side of the yacht, the dazed and anxious faces, all looking exhausted, many sick, some people with burned faces and singed hair, 2 or 3 women holding children, men elbowing their way in front of them, and he felt the same sense of despair he'd felt when Neil showed him the ash on the deck. He was trapped and about to be overwhelmed. "We're headed out into the Atlantic," he shouted over to the other boat. "We can put you ashore at Cape Henry or take you out to sea." Frank saw that most of the fatigued and frightened faces looked at him without comprehension. The ship had come to rescue them. If he'd announced he was sailing to hell, they would still have come aboard. "Bring all your food!" Neil shouted, but no one seemed to pay attention. The men began to clamber over Vagabond's combing, like pirates boarding a ship they planned to plunder. Only Jim and Neil tried to help the weak and injured aboard. A scream broke from the confusion. A pale young blonde woman was soon led sobbing into the wheelhouse, her right hand bloody, apparently being crushed between the two boats. Neil called down to Jean and told to get Macklin and the ship's first aid kit. He had the woman sit down on the wheelhouse settee. Between sobs, the woman kept calling for a cat, and seemed as disturbed by its not being present as by her mangled fingers. The big man with the bushy beard was the only one helping people to escape from the floundering fish killer, and when Frank yelled again to bring all their food and water, he ducked down into the ship's cabin and soon began passing cartons of food across to Jim. A dog snarled at Jean when she brought up the first aid kit, and Neil had an impulse to throw the stupid beast into the sea. Macklin followed, wearing a raincoat. Neil could hear someone retching loudly off the afterdeck and smelled vomit. As Macklin bent to examine the woman's hand, two men began scuffling behind him, and one fell against Neil, knocking him into the seated woman, who screamed in pain. The two men, arms locked around each other in a violent wrestling match, reeled against a young couple and a child in the opposite settee, and then bounced off the wheelhouse floor. Macklin jumped up and grabbed both of them by the hair. He yanked hard and shouted at them to let go. In another half-minute, he and Neil had separated them. It took almost 15 minutes before the 16 survivors and skimpy food supplies of Fishkiller had been transferred to Vagabond. At last, the two ships separated. Vagabond's Genoa ballooning out to port with a flutter and a loud pop, and the derelict wallowing in the swells behind her. The new passengers were scattered in listless confusion throughout the two cockpits, wheelhouse and main cabin. Dressed in suits, slacks, jeans and bathrobes, and bathing suits, were two elderly men, 5 women, 3 children, one of them an infant, and 6 able-bodied men. Neil was aware of at least 1 dog and cat aboard, but in the chaos it seemed like a dozen. Suits, cases, knapsacks and shopping bags were strewn around underfoot. After Vagabond had been sailing on southward toward the mouth of the Cheapsake for several minutes, the big man with the beard, who seemed to have been their leader, came up to Frank, who was at the helm. He removed his foul-weather jacket and boots, but still was wearing the red plastic pants. "My name's Tony Marino," the man announced loudly. "Where the hell are you heading?" He was dressed in blue jeans and a silk shirt and fancy leather loafers. He was a powerfully built man in his late 20s, and he loomed at least a couple of inches over Frank. "We're headed out to sea," Frank replied. "You're not taking us past Norfolk, are you?" the man persisted. "That's right into the fallout." "That's our plan," Frank replied, uncertainty. As he watched Macklin work on the woman's crushed fingers, Neil was aware that 2 couples in the wheelhouse were listening intently to the conversation. Even the woman he was treating seemed to forget about her pain for a moment. "The law of the sea," Frank went on in a tense voice to Tony, "says that anyone rescuing shipwreck survivors can either continue on to his next scheduled port or put them ashore at the nearest point they find convenient. I don't give a fuck about your laws of the sea," Tony broke in. "We're not sailing into a rain of death." "That's right," another man said, coming up in the wheelhouse. "Some of us are sick already. We can't take any more radioactivity." A teenage boy, an older man, and 2 women now gathered near Frank too. As Neil watched, he could feel his anger rising. "What's going on?" another man asked, pushing his way past Neil. "This man is taking us south back into the fallout," Tony answered, loudly. "If you like," Frank began. "I thought we were going north," the second man said. "I did too," the elderly man said. "Away from the explosion." Several additional voices made noises indicating that they agreed. Frank stood frowning. "But in the north," he began again. "Who owns this boat anyway?" Tony asked, looking over aggressively as if someone was trying to put something over on him. "I do," Frank replied, "and well, get us turned around before it's too late." A chorus of yeas resounded after Tony's remark. Neil stood away from the crowd and found Ollie organising the suitcase and knapsacks in the port cockpit. "Go get the .38 that's hidden in my aft cabin," he whispered to him. Ollie nodded solemnly, and when he was gone, Neil descended into the main cabin. 2 strange women and 3 children were seated at a dinette, and Jean and Lisa seemed to be waiting on them. Jean looked up at him intently as he entered. "What's happening now?" she asked anxiously. "Chaos," Neil replied. He walked past her and took Macklin's .45 from its hiding place behind a short shelf of books. After checking the chamber, he returned to the wheelhouse. "I think we'd better head east, Neil," Frank said to him nervously as he came up these steps. "These people think that—" Neil's gun exploded once with a deafening bang. All conversation ceased. He shoved the person nearest him and the others backed away too. Everyone in the wheelhouse and cockpit stared at Neil, who stood for a moment in the centre of the crowd holding his .45, with the barrel just a few inches below his chin, where everyone could see it. He was feeling a strange mixture of desperation, fury and determination. In his yellow foul-weather gear he looked strangely out of place among the crowd of refugees. "All right," he began in a loud, tense voice. I want you all to listen, and I want you to get it. We're at war, and I'm your commanding officer. I expect everyone here to obey me as if I was God incarnate, without hesitancy and without question. I've commanded regular naval ships, 10 times this size, and I've been on sailing boats like this for 10 years. If anyone else on board feels he's better qualified, he'd better speak up now." There was a silence, and when Neil felt some people beginning to stir restlessly, he plunged on. "Good," he went on, still speaking loudly. "Frank Stower, here beside me, who owns this boat, is first mate. You treat him as you would me. Captain Ollie, the old fellow standing over there, is second mate, and Jim at the helm now is third mate. They are the ship's officers, and their word is law. If anyone willfully disobeys any of our commands, I will personally throw him overboard. Do you get it?" No one spoke. Most were falling back into that listlessness that they'd had before Tony stirred them up. "Good," said Neil after a pause, aware now of the sweat dripping down his face, of Frank staring at him uncertainly, of Tony looking at him with a mixture of fear and resentment. "As captain, I'm announcing that our course is going through the fallout area around Norfolk and out into the Atlantic." A few groans greeted this statement, but Neil cut them off immediately. "Shut up!" he shouted. "We're heading south until I feel it's safe to make landfall. You may feel that we ought to have a democratic discussion of what we ought to do. I don't give a shit how you feel. If you don't like this policy, I'll give you a life preserver and you can go in a different direction. You may decide later, when you're out in the Atlantic, that you wish you'd never left land. Bitch among yourselves all you like, but obey." "But what if," someone began, "anyone who willfully disobeys one of my commands will be thrown overboard?" When Neil paused again, no one spoke. "You're beginning to understand," Neil went on more quietly. "Now for some commands. First of all, I want all weapons, guns and knives with a blade longer than 2 inches, turned over to the ship's officers immediately. These weapons will return to you when we part company. Anyone found with a weapon on his person or in his luggage 10 minutes from now will be thrown overboard." Silence. "Second, I want this area around the wheel and around the winches kept clear. When an officer orders you to go sit someplace on the boat, you go sit there and you don't move without permission. Consider where he puts you to be your battle station. Thirdly, anyone who brought food aboard shall immediately contribute all of it to the ship's stores. If you leave sooner, it will be returned to you. We're sharing our ship, our weapons, our water, our food and our skills with you. We expect you to do the same with us. Anyone caught hoarding a private stash of food, or eating or permitting his children or her children to eat any of the ship's food not rationed out to them will be thrown overboard." Again Neil paused, aware that Jim was watching him. "What if we have to go to the bathroom?" a woman asked in a frightened voice. "If a man has to piss, he goes to the leeward side of the boat and he pisses into the bay," Neil replied in the same loud, tense voice. "If you don't know which side of the boat is, ask an officer. Knowing which side of the boat to piss off is what made him an officer in the first place." Ollie chuckled, but the others were too frightened or too awed to respond. "Ladies will piss in buckets provided in the side cabins. A mate will see to it their contents are tossed overboard." "Aren't there marine toilets?" someone asked. "Yes, there are. But the animal species capable of landing men on the moon and blowing the world apart has yet to develop a marine toilet that doesn't clog if you stare at it too long. While we're this crowded and while we've got more important things on our minds, we won't be using them." This time, when he hesitated, Neil felt that he got his point across, but perhaps too strongly. "I sound harsh," he continued. "I intend to be harsh. I intend this ship and those remaining aboard it to survive. My experience has been that in life or death situations, the traditional naval way of doing things is the only one that works. This policy is not open to discussion. Are there any questions?" The silence boat Vagabond, as she sailed serenely down the ship's spake in the direction most people thought they didn't want to go, was uncanny. No one spoke. Most of those he looked at simply looked numb. "What if we have to vomit?" an elderly man finally asked. "If you feel seasick, go to the leeward cockpit and lean over the coaming. Vomit to leeward." Neil paused. "Anyone caught vomiting to windward will be thrown overboard. Anyone who vomits to windward will also be covered with vomit, so he'll probably be happy to be thrown overboard." A few nervous giggles. "All right," Neil concluded. "All weapons and food to the ship's officers. Anyone attempting to resist these commands will be shot. Ollie, Frank, get the weapons first." "Jesus, Neil," Frank said half an hour later, when Vagabond was as calm and as orderly as a concentration camp. "Don't you think you're a little hard on them?" "No," Neil replied. "We're all trying to survive. Everyone on this boat, everyone, will lie, steal, cheat and kill in order to survive. That speech served one purpose, to let their survival instinct know that the first thing it has to consider is me, and whatever promotes the survival of this ship. It was nice of you to let me to be first mate on my own boat." Neil looked at Frank with total seriousness. "It wasn't nice," he said. "You deserved it." Frank stared at him. "You bastard." "You better believe it," Neil said coldly. "When I said everyone obeys my commands, I meant everyone. I see. I hope so.